For my money, the best car chase in any movie ever is the Paris chase in Ronin, John Frankenheimer's 1998 crime thriller starring Robert De Niro. It's not the flashiest chase, it's not the most explosive, it's not the craziest, and it's not the one with the most destruction. Those would be Bad Boys 2, 21 Jump Street, What's Up Doc, and the Fast 5 safe scene, respectively. Compared to those, this one is pretty simple. It's just two cars in Paris going really, really fast. But it's a scene where you find yourself holding your breath because of its overwhelming sense of speed and danger. To me, what makes it the best ever is its emphasis on clarity and realism. You always know exactly what's happening and where the cars are in relation to each other. The scene has an extremely simple visual language, only really using 4 kinds of shots. Wide shots from the POV of the cars with the camera mounted on the front bumper. Wide shots of the front of the cars moving backwards with them. Stationary wide shots filmed from a bystander's perspective, and close-ups of the actors in the cars. The scene is full of little details that emphasize the reality of the situation, like the way a driver rapidly flashes her lights to signal cars to move out of the way, the inserts of hands shifting gears or pulling the emergency brake, the part where the car hauler brakes quickly and a car falls off the top of it. There isn't even any music for the first 4 minutes of the scene, just the sounds of the cars. It captures the feeling of speeding dangerously through a city better than any movie I've ever seen. It's the movie equivalent of when your Uber driver is going way too fast and you're convinced that he's about to get you killed. It's a scene with the confidence to hold on this shot for 8 full seconds, an eternity in a modern action scene, and every stressful second feels like a lifetime. The influence of the Ronin chase can be seen on car chases for the next 20 years, especially others in Paris, like The Bourne Identity and Mission Impossible Fallout. But as great as this is, as astounding as Frankenheimer's method of shooting cars is, he actually did all of this 30 years earlier. Back in the 1960s, John Frankenheimer revolutionized the way that cars in movies are filmed. So for more on this, let's go to the place where it happened. Hello, and welcome to Monaco. It is currently one day after the legendary Monaco Grand Prix, one of the most famous races in all of professional automobile racing. So did I come here to watch the race? No, I don't care about Formula One. And even if I did, it's like stupidly expensive to visit here during race weekend. No, I showed up a day after the race because I'm not here to talk about the Grand Prix. I'm here to talk about a movie about the Grand Prix. A movie called Grand Prix. And so the Euro trip continues. Since Nobbles is still using the Nebula studio back in New York, I decided to treat myself to the second cheapest hotel room in all of Monaco, which, still not cheap. When I was figuring out where to go after Cannes, I realized that Monaco is only a 1-hour train ride away, so this seemed like the perfect place to experience some real culture and history. And I gotta say, Monaco is a funny place. After Vatican City, it's the smallest state in the world. It's sort of like Europe's Las Vegas. An insane percentage of the population here is just millionaires. Like, with the amount of yachts docked in the harbor, they really need to make a new killer shark movie and set it here, because I think that would rule. And speaking of movies, there have been a lot of movies set here. Several James Bond movies, Alfred Hitchcock's To Catch a Thief, the Selena Gomez vehicle, Monte Carlo, but I've always wanted to visit ever since I watched Grand Prix. And I figured that if I filmed a video about it here, that it makes the trip a tax write-off. See, I think John Frankenheimer is a director that everyone should be talking about all of the time, if not solely for the fact that his name kind of sounds like Frankenstein, and that's fun. He's not just the guy who shot cars in motion better than maybe any filmmaker ever. He's a director with one of the greatest 6-movie runs of all time. I'm talking about The Birdman of Alcatraz, The Manchurian Candidate, 7 Days in May, The Train, Seconds, and then Grand Prix. Like, sure, he never reached the heights of the 70s auteurs who came shortly after him, and he doesn't have the stylistic quirks that get modern film students all aflutter. He never won an Oscar, but he was nominated for a Razzie for The Island of Dr. Moreau. The Razzies fucking suck. Anyway, John Frankenheimer was simply one of the greatest studio journeymen to ever do it, and in particular, he was one of the greatest action filmmakers of all time. And so, we are here today to talk about one of his action movies, Grand Prix, his 3-hour epic about Formula One, a movie that is almost 60 years old that I would argue changed action cinema forever, whose impact can still be seen in movies that don't even open until next year. All of the brilliant visual choices from the greatest car chase in film history can be traced back to this, like a Rosetta Stone with the inscription, "Cool cars go fast." When talking about the Ronin chase, Frankenheimer said, "I did the whole thing in the style of Grand Prix, with the camera mounts in about the same places." But if we want to understand just how revolutionary this movie really was, we're gonna have to go back to the beginning. So now we have to look at the history of cars in movies. From back before they were portrayed as anthropomorphic stereotypes, like in Cars, or action stars, like in Transformers, or in the case of Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, both. Automobiles are about as old as cinema, and in many ways their histories parallel each other. Both technologies evolved during the 1800s, and by the end of that century, each had solidified into the form we recognize now. By the early 1900s, each had developed its own industry in America and could be mass-produced. And so, unsurprisingly, cars have been the focus of movies since the very beginning. During the silent era, there were comedies like The Speed Kings with Fatty Arbuckle, and Kid Auto Races at Venice, featuring Charlie Chaplin's first appearance as his iconic tramp character. The Roaring Road in 1919 was a more serious drama about racing, and Speedway, 10 years later, about the Indianapolis 500, shot footage at the actual race. As the sound era began, a major innovation in filmmaking technology arrived that would be a part of just about every film involving cars made for the next few decades. An innovation that, coincidentally, is also my euphemism for when someone poops. Rear projection. In 1932, Howard Hawks' The Crowd Roars was the first racing film to use rear projection, but it was soon seen in just about everything. Even though the marketing for Speed in 1936 proudly advertised that star Jimmy Stewart had driven over 140 miles per hour himself, the racing scenes were still full of rear projection for all the shots of the actors. And so, for the next few decades, car scenes mostly remained pretty much the same. They would primarily be shot with stationary cameras on tripods, filming from the side of the road. Shots of actors behind the wheel were always on rear projection, shot in studios. Sometimes the cameras would be in motion, mounted on camera trucks following the action, but they would almost never be mounted on the actual cars. This is why it felt pretty revolutionary in the 1949 Mickey Rooney racing film The Big Wheel to have this shot, a camera mounted on the car behind the front wheel. And it's even more impressive considering that cars back then looked like if you pressed the gas pedal too hard, they would just explode. Seriously, I would not trust those things. Even 1955's The Racers, starring Kirk Douglas, which used more advanced vehicle-mounted camera work than any previous film, still relied extensively on rear projection. In the early 1960s, whether it was James Bond or Elvis behind the wheel, every car scene was generally shot the same. The most realistic car photography of the era was in Howard Hawks' Red Line 7000, amazing title, starring a young James Caan. It used car-mounted POV shots, more camera movement during the races, but still used rear projection for all the shots of the drivers. Where some special effects of the era, like miniatures or stop-motion animation, still feel really exciting and creative today, I think that rear projection driving scenes now mostly feel just kinda dated and fake, like they were too lazy to find a way to put actors in real cars. And of course, it wouldn't be until decades later when filmmakers would start using rear projection as an artistic choice, like in Europa, or Pulp Fiction, or Toonce's The Driving Cat. I don't want it to seem like I'm saying all car scenes from the 30s through the mid-60s are bad, because they're not. Some of them are actually pretty impressive for their time. Especially The Big Wheel, with its creative use of different angles and propulsive editing, and there are tons of great car stunts and crashes throughout these movies, especially in like the silent era with Buster Keaton. But the majority of them feel similar because they're all shot the same way, mostly from the objective perspective of bystanders watching as the cars drive by. None of them really capture the feeling of what it might be like to be in those cars until Grand Prix. And then, a few decades later, David Cronenberg showed us what it would be like to like really be inside a car. But that's not what this episode is about, so anyway, back to Grand Prix. As soon as Grand Prix begins, you can feel a massive change from everything that came before it. In seconds, car scenes went from this to this. Frankenheimer and his crew, led by cinematographer Lionel Linden, took a documentary approach to the racing scenes. Now, usually, documentary approach implies lots of shaky handheld camera work, but here, it meant authentically capturing the experience of what it would be like to literally be in one of these cars. This was pure subjective filmmaking in a way that had never been done before with vehicles like these. This time, the racing scenes didn't feel like you were a spectator watching from the sidelines. Now, you were actually in it. Less fly on the wall, and more fly splattered on a windshield going 180 miles per hour. Frankenheimer insisted on total authenticity, so there were no process shots or matte shots, and absolutely no rear projection. So this meant mounting cameras on the actual cars. And Frankenheimer also refused to use the traditional technique of shooting at a lower frame rate so that the footage plays back slightly faster. Nope, they weren't doing that. Everything had to be done for real, with the cars going full speed. The biggest difference between Grand Prix and all the car scenes that came before is that here, the camera is almost always in motion. The shot that Frankenheimer returns to again and again is this. A POV shot with the camera mounted right on the front of the car, going forward just a few inches off the ground. It's the same shot he would use repeatedly 30 years later in Ronin. At one point in the opening Monaco race, Frankenheimer holds this shot for a full 1 minute and 22 seconds, more than half a lap. There's no music, no dialogue, just a pure continuous shot from the car's point of view. It is honestly astonishing. This kind of thing is unheard of in an action scene like this. Like look at this, it's still going. YouTube, please don't copyright claim this video for this shot. This is important to show. Old Johnny Frankenheimer is just showing off here. This is insane. Okay, fine, I'll cut the shot off there, you get the idea. So other than the POV shot, the main other angles used in the race scenes are variations on these. Car-mounted shots of the drivers, usually using extremely wide lenses that fit both the actor and almost the entire car into the frame, so that there is no doubt at all that the actors, like James Garner and Yves Montand, are driving these cars for real. Legendary driver and automotive designer Carroll Shelby was the racing supervisor for the film and trained most of the cast to be able to do their own driving in actual Formula One cars. And also, checking the dates here, that means that this shoot was happening during the time of the events portrayed in the film Ford vs. Ferrari. And so, if you ask me, it is a huge missed opportunity in that movie not to have a subplot where Matt Damon is working on the Grand Prix shoot. Like, James Mangold, come on, man, what are you doing? Okay, now if you'll allow me, I need to go all real engineering here for a minute and talk about the insane engineering of these cameras, because it's actually really impressive and really interesting. So Frankenheimer turned to camera operator John Stevens to figure out how to actually shoot the racing scenes, because this had never really been done before. And they were shooting on 65mm film, not the standard 35mm, which made the whole thing even more complicated. They had to mount Panavision 65mm cameras, which on their own weigh 38 pounds, and with the full mounting rig weigh 120 pounds, onto Formula One cars. And so Bill Frick designed rigs that were able to keep the cameras safely anchored and the cars balanced. The rig Stevens and crew developed would be fully remote controlled, so Stevens would have a small monitor and control box that would allow him to remotely pan and tilt the camera, pull focus, and change the aperture, all while the camera was rolling on a car moving well over 100 miles per hour, which involved using a system developed by the Pelco company that was designed for tracking missiles that could control the cameras from up to a mile away. Much of the filming, including all of the POV shots, was done from a specially designed camera car, a Ford GT40 that was driven by legendary Formula One champion Phil Hill. This car would often have 3 cameras mounted on it simultaneously, while Stevens would sit in the passenger seat with the control box operating these cameras. Motorola developed special radio helmets, so Frankenheimer, Stevens, and the actors in the cars could stay in communication and issue directions. The racing scenes also required Panavision to develop special lenses, a 17mm hyper-wide lens, and then, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a 1000mm lens. And because of the tight schedule of the shoot, each of the 6 race scenes, which were filmed at actual European Formula One tracks, had to be shot pretty much live, with the races staged for real, with no time to restage the cars and do additional takes. Which is, frankly, an absurd level of pressure, but, you know, I guess it probably did lead to more realistic racing scenes? So as I'm watching the racing scenes over and over, I'm trying to figure out what it is about them that makes them still to this day some of the very best car sequences ever filmed. Frankenheimer's obsession with realism here isn't just about the placement of the cameras. There's an attention to the finer details of the cars and of racing that runs through the whole movie. The film begins first showing actual Formula One drivers before any of the actors appear, grounding this movie in the reality of real racing of the time. The whole opening title sequence is a montage of small technical details. Brakes being tested, nuts being tightened, gloves being pulled on, gauges measuring tire pressure. It's telling us that these things matter. The first race intercuts interviews with the major characters, and Garner's character talks about how there are 2,600 gear changes during the Monaco race. And throughout all the races, Frankenheimer uses insert shots of feet and hands shifting gears, pressing the clutch and gas pedal in a way that past driving films almost never bothered with. And it's the same thing that he would do 30 years later in Ronin. Ferrari had long had a policy of dismissing Hollywood productions because they weren't realistic enough, or as the Italians would say, they were not the real deal. But Frankenheimer's commitment to realism and attention to detail is what convinced Ferrari to change their minds and let the film use their cars, their factory, and their actual racing team. Beyond just the different racetracks, Frankenheimer makes each race distinct by adding new visual language as the film goes on. In the final race, he introduces a brand new kind of shot. Here, the camera is mounted on the side of the car, looking at the actor in profile. But then, using Stevens' radio controls, the camera is able to pan right until it is pointing forward, right behind the car's front wheel. This means that during parts of the race when cars are trying to overtake each other, the camera is able to smoothly follow the action while still mounted right on the car, and even today, this is really impressive. Another innovation was the aerial photography used throughout the races. Surprisingly, until Grand Prix, filming car races from helicopters was pretty rare. But here, camera operator Stevens used Nelson Tyler's revolutionary helicopter camera mount, which was developed just 2 years earlier, and allowed much more stable aerial footage than ever before. He had a 90 to 250mm zoom lens attached to the camera and was somehow able to get insane shots like this one, which starts as a tight close-up of Yves Montan's car, then steadily zooms out until it reveals this massive panorama of all the cars. So while Grand Prix was obviously a major game changer for car-based filmmaking, there were a couple movies from a few years before it that may have actually been an influence on Frankenheimer, and so I gotta mention them here. The first is Roger Corman's The Young Racers from 1963. This movie actually has some striking similarities, such as focusing on the Formula One circuit and opening with the Monaco Grand Prix, and it's one of the only movies ever made up to that point that did not use rear projection, instead filming the real actors on location in the cars. Of course, here, it's probably done because it's a Roger Corman movie and they barely had any money to work with, but you've got to give them a ton of credit for what they pull off. And it's also worth mentioning that both Francis Ford Coppola and future Days of Thunder screenwriter Robert Towne worked on the crew of the movie. And then there is the German travel documentary Flying Clipper, also known as Mediterranean Holiday, from 1962. This was shot on 70mm film and has a sequence filmed at the Monaco Grand Prix using car-mounted cameras in a way that seems possibly like a pretty major influence on Frankenheimer. Now, this next part might sound a little bit weird, but stick with me. I think a big part of what makes Grand Prix so singular is that it combines an intense focus on documentary-level realism with extreme stylization. And this latter component comes courtesy of Saul Bass. Now, you all know Saul Bass. He's obviously the guy who directed Phase 4, the classic movie about the evil ant colony. And yes, sure, I guess he is also technically the most famous opening title designer of all time, designing the iconic titles for movies like Psycho, Goodfellas, North by Northwest, Anatomy of a Murder, Vertigo, It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, and like so many more. But anyway, on Grand Prix, Bass was credited as visual consultant, montages, and titles. So yes, he did the opening title design, but then he was actually often on set directing parts of the racing sequences. And his work on these sequences adds something that separates them from just about all other car films. Let's look again at the opening of the film. I already mentioned the montage of the details of the cars and drivers getting ready, but look at how it's put together. It's all shot with these incredibly long lenses, focusing in super tight on each detail, which Bass then turns into split screens, multiplying the shot sometimes dozens of times within a single frame. We never see the location, just these increasingly claustrophobic shots, as Bass then starts to slow down time, dropping out the sound to replace it with the driver's heartbeat. Here, he's coiling the tension tighter and tighter, like stretching out the countdown to the green light in Mario Kart for 4 full minutes. Until then, when the drivers finally hit the gas and take off, the film immediately pulls back into wide shots, then sweeping helicopter shots following the cars, and it gives it this insane explosion of energy. During the first race, Bass uses a 3-column split screen in parts where the racers are being interviewed explaining their racing philosophy. This split screen shows more details of the racing, the pedals and the gear shifts, and it slows the pace of the scene down and gives us more visual information to take in. And then, as it returns to the race, the screen wipes across following the motion of a car, rushing back into full screen as we resume full speed. The second race is the most Bass-heavy sequence in the film. This one is pure stylization, all shown from the perspective of Eva Marie Saint's character as she's falling in love with Yves Montagn's character by watching him drive. And so the race becomes a dance. The cars are filmed through flowers. The sound pulls away. It just becomes this collage of light and color and movement. Then in a later race, Bass takes us inside the drivers' heads by overlaying montages to show what they're thinking about, their fears and anxieties consuming them and actually messing up their driving. Bass's montages, with split screens and crossfades and overlays, add a level of stylization that is extremely uncommon in what are usually streamlined, no bullshit, muscular movies. It's easy to imagine dudes who are here for the realistic car stuff complaining about this artsy bullshit, but I actually think it makes the racing scenes more powerful. The kind of montages that Bass contributes have never been in vogue for this kind of movie, and actually, there's only one other racing film I can think of that manages to capture a similar level of visual power. And that film, of course, is the Wachowskis' Speed Racer, a racing film that seems the opposite of Grand Prix in every way. A film that is so stylized, so uninterested in realism, that the racing scenes are able to transcend traditional rules of filmmaking. One sec. Nobbles, what is it?
Hey Patrick, are you talking about Speed Racer?
Yeah, I'm like, mentioned it briefly.
Every episode you compare everything to Speed Racer. You literally brought it up in the last episode. Even other Patrick would bring it up all the time. And yet you've never actually made a video about that movie. The people demand to know, when is it happening?
Nobbles? Nobbles? Shut up, okay? Don't tell me what episodes to make. I can do this fine on my own, all right? I didn't ask for your input.
Sorry, I'm needed back on set.
Okay, well, now that that's over, I want to ask a big question. What is the greatest power that cinema has? That's something that we can debate until the end of time. Cinema has so many elements of other mediums. Visual art, theater, literature, music, but what is unique to it? What it can do better than any other medium is motion. I mean, they are called motion pictures for a reason, and this is what I think Grand Prix does better than almost any movie ever made. I talked a minute ago about that opening sequence, how it starts with several minutes of tight, static imagery, and then from the second the race begins, there's barely a static shot for the next 15 minutes. When Frankenheimer holds on that one shot for 1 minute and 22 seconds, it's just to revel in the sensation of pure motion. It's what makes the choice of Monaco for the opening race so effective. All the other races are in more remote, rural locations, but Monaco is so crowded and so dense, with so many buildings and bystanders, that the motion registers even more whizzing by all that detail. The aerial shots are even more exciting as they wind their way through the crowded, busy streets. The movie's story continually asks the question, why do these men keep doing this? Putting themselves behind the wheel of the car that, in the opening scene, is described as like being inside of a bomb.
These cars, you sit in a box, a coffin, gasoline all around you. It is like being inside a bomb.
Why do they keep doing this despite the death and heartbreak and ruined lives that come from this lifestyle? They're gobbling up danger like ordinary men eat peanuts. And the racing scenes, wordlessly, answer that question. By putting the audience in the driver's seat, we experience the thrill of driving at that speed, the rush of energy, the freedom. The POV shot that Frankenheimer returns to again and again is like a flight simulator, just pure, unobstructed motion. If any programmers from New York City repertory theaters are watching this, please show Grand Prix in 70mm. I want to see it in a theater so bad. In terms of racing movies, I don't think anything has matched the power of Grand Prix racing scenes in the 60 years since it was made. Like, I love Ford versus Ferrari, and the racing scenes in that movie are good, but they're also busier, they're edited faster, and they lack the simple power of what Grand Prix does, which, as we established, is sometimes holding one shot for over a minute. Grand Prix was released in 1966, right as a major shift in American cinema was about to happen. The following year, as explored in Mark Harris's great book, Pictures at a Revolution, was a turning point in the industry. This was where the glossy, big-budget studio spectacles of the old Hollywood, like Dr. Dolittle, went out of style. And in their place came the edgy, innovative new films of the new Hollywood, exploring more mature subject matter, such as Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. And Grand Prix has a foot in each world. It announces itself right up front as being presented in Cinerama, the super-wide curved screen that utilized 3 projectors, used for the biggest of big-screen spectacles. It was shot on 65mm film and blown up to be projected on 70mm, but the days of the Cinerama spectacle wouldn't last long. In 1965, 7 films were released in Cinerama. In 1966, there were 3. And by the end of the 60s, it was down to just 1 a year. In the following decade, only 2 Cinerama films would be released. But while Grand Prix was sold as a spectacle-filled epic, its focus on immersive, subjective realism was brand new, something that felt far more in line with the more grounded movies to come in the following years. 5 years later, William Friedkin's The French Connection would be released, a gritty, bleak New York crime thriller that would win the Oscar for Best Picture, and it would become most famous for its incredible car chase, which utilizes many of the techniques innovated in Grand Prix, especially the great POV shot. And beyond just The French Connection, Grand Prix's impact can be seen on almost every car-related movie that's been made since. Rear projection quickly went out of style in the next few years, and car-mounted cameras showing the actors behind the wheel became standard. Steve McQueen, who was offered the lead role in Grand Prix but passed, was determined to equal its level of realism in his own vehicular action movies such as Bullitt in 1968 and his racing passion project Le Mans in 1971. And you can see the impact of Grand Prix in the Mad Max movies, Duel, Drive, Death Proof, Rush, Ford vs. Ferrari. It even feels like the precursor to Top Gun Maverick, a movie rightfully celebrated for its astonishing aerial sequences, where they mounted cameras on and inside actual jets, giving the audience the experience of piloting one themselves. That is the exact same approach used in the driving scenes in Grand Prix, just a different type of vehicle. And now, Top Gun Maverick director Joseph Kosinski has a new movie coming soon, and it feels appropriate that it just dropped its first trailer as I was writing this episode. Sure, all we have is a less than 2-minute trailer to analyze, but when has that ever stopped me? From the F1 footage we have here, we can already see it picking up where Grand Prix left off. There's an emphasis on smooth, car-mounted racing photography that, of course, is slicker and more complex than was possible in 1966. But there's one shot in particular that feels straight out of Grand Prix. It's this one. This car-mounted pan, as the camera turns around 180 degrees, definitely operated with a remote control camera head. It is simply an updated version of this one, from the camera rig invented for Grand Prix. I feel like this movie is oddly forgotten. In discussions of essential car cinema, we still talk about Bullitt and The French Connection, and maybe it's because there's, a less robust history of car racing cinema compared to car chase cinema, but at the end of the day, it's all car cinema. The common criticisms of Grand Prix are that the non-racing parts of the movie are boring, but I don't know, I actually think it's all pretty solid. You've got romantic drama, you've got racing team politics, people recovering from serious injuries, people getting killed. I mean, I think it's all pretty good. But also, yes, the scenes where cars go vroom vroom real fast are still the best part. And look, I don't even really care about cars in real life. I have never owned a car before because, come on, I live in New York City, where it is so much faster and easier to just walk or take public transit. Why the hell would I own a car here? But anyway, the point is, like any person with 2 eyes and a heart, I love car movies. And if you care at all about car movies, then Grand Prix is as important a car movie as any one that was ever made. When I rewatched the racing sequences, I struggled to find examples in the subsequent 60 years where these were topped, where the car footage felt more visceral, or more thrilling, or more innovative. Except maybe for Speed Racer. Shit, am I gonna have to just finally make an episode on it? Am I gonna prove Nobbles right? Oh God, there's nothing I hate more. So I spent this whole video talking about cameras and how it matters where they're positioned, how shots are framed, different lenses, all of that stuff. And maybe while you were listening to me, you were thinking, I don't actually really know much about how any of that works, and I'd really kind of like to learn more. But before you book a flight to New York to find me in person and demand that I give you private lessons, I have a better idea that is faster and cheaper and just more pleasant for all of us. So instead of doing that, right now on your computer where you're probably watching this, just go to your browser and type in Skillshare, our sponsor for this episode. At Skillshare, you will find tons of classes taught by professionals all about cinematography, like Mastering Cinematic Compositions in Video and Film by Jordy Vandeput, or Cinematography Basics, Introduction to Lighting Techniques by Zach Mulligan. Now these are obviously super helpful if you're interested in making your own films and videos, but they're also great if you just want to know more about what goes into creating the movies that you watch. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, and they've got thousands of classes led by industry experts. Not just about filmmaking. They have classes on illustration, photography, design, productivity, writing, even interior design and cooking. You can learn at your own pace, no matter your skill level, and they have plenty of curated lists of classes to help guide you. So if you want to develop some skills that you can then share with your friends and family, the first 500 people to use my link in the description of this video right down there will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So go, get started today. Learn some stuff, build some skills. It's great.